I'm jet-lagged. And I'm half an hour. I will repeat now. I will perform a bit. I will repeat a bit of Xavier's performance from a few days ago. So I'm half an hour and a bit more after my time, but I'm 6 hours physically back. So I still have 5 hours and a half to talk, to finish this presentation, to be in my time. So I would like to, I prepared the paper and I prepared the presentation, and then I changed my paper in the last 2 days thoroughly, and then I gave up the presentation also. So I decided not to show any images, but I will insist on talking about the images that I will not show mostly. One of the reasons is that I'm troubled by the way how we talk about the images, specifically images of performance. And maybe this is something also that I will try to bring into this discussion, and this is the fact that we confront the image, specifically image from the performance, and then we see somebody being in the performance, performing something, and then we name exactly by what they do the content of that image. And I think that this discourse of naming what we do instead of talking about the things that we produce is the prevalent mode of discussion on the performance today. And it's very much in correspondence to the dominant mode of presentation of the performance, specifically in performing arts institutions today. And I would like to focus exactly on that. So I'm interested in infrastructure. I'm interested in institutions deeply. I like the institutions. I hate them the way they are. But I like the idea of the institutions. I would say that if we wouldn't institute our practices, all of them would disappear. I have a recent experience from being in Yugoslavia in the 80s. Boris will also remember. In the 80s, we had so-called alternative culture dominant in Yugoslavia, and it was highly anti-institutional. And when the war came, everything was just erased. Everybody had to leave. People didn't work there anymore. The institutions that existed there, they started to present the worst nationalist type of culture. And all the things that were produced by the brave artists from the 80s were simply on pause for 10 years or more. And then in the 90s, end of 90s, we started to dig back and to look for these things which couldn't be seen anymore, the things that disappeared. So that's why I like the institutions. The other thing is that I think that institutions are real. Infrastructure is as real as we are. And they also have their agency. They demand the production. But the problem is that production is disappearing from the institutions. What we are confronting is a culture of presentation and care of spectator, which is very much fitting the logic of contemporary populist politics, which is implementing valorization models on the basis of numbers, accountability of labor, accountability of artists' doings, because today institutions basically produce this kind of accountability by numbering amounts of our being somewhere, dwelling somewhere, staying, residenting, lecturing, laboratorying, experimenting, teaching, researching, etc. All of that has its price. All of that can be paid. All of that you can apply for, and you can put it in front as something that we call application, formula to calculate how much the artist's work is worth today. But let me make a bit of break, and then I will come back to the problems. There are 3 first films ever made. Those who have heard me lately will be bored now, but I usually show these films, so there might be some difference now. So there are 3 first films ever made. All of them have the same title, same length, same number of images. They are called Workers Leaving Lumiere Factory in Lyon. The first one is the one in which you see just a chaotic movement of people, ignorant people, towards an object that records them, the camera, and they come out of the factory and they come back to the factory. It's a 50 seconds long shot, 800 images. And this movie marks the beginning of moving pictures. And what is very interesting in this first movie is that you see a factory and the beginning of film in the same time. The same people who made the film are the owners of the factory. There is the second film, first film ever made, or the second take of the first film ever made, Workers Leaving Lumiere Factory, where you see the workers coming out of the factory, but now much more chaotically. So the guys discovered the machine, and they realized that it worked. So they made their workers really move here and there, and cars are coming with, with horses and dogs going here and there. So everything is much more in movement, and people look at the camera also when they come out. And then you see that, it's becoming alive. It's repeating itself. People perform for the camera. And then there is the third take, which is also the first film ever directed. In that film, everything starts with the gate opening. All the workers manage to leave in time, in the same 50 seconds, length of the first reel, and the gate closes. It means that that was a first film ever choreographed also. There are many things in this film, in these three films, that I find paradigmatic for everything that will happen afterwards. The first thing that interests me is the fact that with the appearance of the film, work leaves the factory and becomes an image. Workers are coming out of the factory and they become an image. And the work of the image is introduced in the way how the work is represented in general. And Harun Farokhi, in his movie on workers leaving the factory, has much more to say than me, probably, at this point. But there is another thing there. This film, organization of the third take, coincides completely with the logic of mode of production at that time, cutting out unnecessary movement from the flow of workers, same as at the assembly lines in the factories, and emerging of the serial images, what will mark the film, future of the film. So, parallel between choreography, performance of people, performing workers for the sake of the film, is coinciding with the changing mode of production or dominant mode of production. But then this kind of production of images throughout the 20th century became a dominant mode of production. Production of the images, production of representation, and production of the performances. So I will here make three blunt statements. And I like blunt statements just because that I need that in these melodramatic times when we all the time cry about catastrophe and resistance and the problems, I hopefully will not fall down, that we need a bit of what Brecht calls plumpes denken, this kind of non-elegant thinking, like just, let's think a bit through the praxis, and maybe we come somewhere, and in the light of new event, maybe we will know more, and then we, to add another interpreter of Brecht, pull a brake, and then look behind. But first we have to imagine ourselves flying with the flow of train going there and then stopping our bodies and looking back and trying to interpret with a bit of nachdenken what happened. So these three blunt statements will be related to, first of all, the problem of infrastructure that I mentioned. And by infrastructure, I mean an institutional frame of production and distribution, but also interconnection of dispositives of apparati of presentation. So besides the fact that there are institutions where we produce, there is also a continuity between several apparati of representation, namely cinema, theater, gallery in this case, because I think they are very crucial in infrastructural terms for another obsession of mine besides the labor, and this is watching as a labor of watching and labor of images that are watched. Sorry, not labor of images, but work of the images. And the second perspective is the emphasis on poetics of performance. From 60s on, instead of fetishization of praxis. So more or less, we are talking today about the ways how people do the things, But I'm really interested what is produced by that and how do we produce it. There are two projects that I will relate to if I manage to do it all in time, because my introduction is still going on and it's already half of my time. There are two projects I will relate to. One is East Dance Academy. It was a collaborative project between organizations from Romania, Ljubljana, Belgrade, and Zagreb, where we researched the history of piercing through of choreographic thinking in other artistic formats like experimental film, performance art, cinema, in general, popular culture, but also in collective culture, and there are still some results coming out of that research among different people who took part in that. And the other is a collective process of BEDCO, collective that I work with, that I'm a member of as a dramaturg, performer, director, choreographer, sometimes whatever they call me at which point. So now, first three blunt statements. The first one is about so-called curatorial turn. So I'm coming from performing arts institutions. And we are there working in the institutions which have at the heads of these institutions in the last 20 years new functions. And they're calling themselves curators. From 80s on, the institutions in performing arts thoroughly changed. In 80s, they were calling themselves programmers, and those were the guys who had small structures who took care about number of artists to produce their work and to distribute their work. And they organized different networks, etc. From 90s on, we have a shift in the institutions where people who are running the institutions are curators, and if you read a bit the discourse that is coming out from their discussions, there are several publications about it, etc. They mostly talk not anymore about their artists, as programmers did, but about their audience. And there is a lot of work invested into the programming of watching, programming of the ways how some people who are usually called normal people, as if there are some others, okay, leave it alone. I don't know. So what would normal people understand, how they would see it, and how they would react to that? So programming of watching that stands in front of the institution and enormous shrinking of the amount of production of the work. So the budgets for production are coming down from something that was usually 20,000, 30,000, it's coming now to from 5 to 15,000 or something like that, just in numbers. And it all usually comes from EU funding and not from the local funding from the institution or from the core budget of the institution. Parallelly with that turn, there was a continuous care within the performing arts among the artists and also curators for the spectator. So from being involved, being interpreted, being communized, being activated, being reflected, being staged as an expert. I would say that the position that the spectator today takes in a performing arts institution is what Schlegel called ideal spectator. That was the name, how he named the chorus in Greek tragedy. The spectator that knows how to watch the performance. And I would call it programmed spectator. Something that is related not to the programming of institution, but to the programming of spectating. This new ecology, where the artist becomes less and less present by her artworks and more with her labor, is nowadays promoted by various cultural institutions whose mission is no longer production, but rather reproduction of consumer relations with the work of art. Art institutions are not anymore disciplinary instances whose task is to take care of the artist and production of the artworks, just like milk industry is not producing anymore the best yogurt, but the most desired yogurt. Performing arts institutions today no longer produce works of art to present it to the public, who then has the opportunity to valorize it. Rather, valorization itself is being produced and exchanged. The new atomization of labor, something that I said that is accountable into images, into practice objects, is not so much derived from the need to demystify the mystery of art creation, as they were calling it some time ago, as it is a symptom of rationalization and accountability of artistic labor. Having in mind that art no longer functions outside of the institutional and market system, as Stilinovic also underlined in his The Praise of Laziness, neither Duchamp's logic of non-work nor Malevich's utopist laziness today produce the effect of setting artistic labor free from purposefulness found outside of that labor. Quite the contrary, Boris Groys claims, artistic labor has been alienated and utilized as an instrument through institutional production processes, the very process that allowed Duchamp to break free from material work in the production of art. Post-Duchampian artistic labor has been proletarianized through material work of transfer and construction, really like kind of material work that artist does today in the institutions, to which I would also add the institutional organization, which is very often, or more often, a responsibility of the artist also. However, at this point we come to an important turnaround. This type of transforming artistic labor into a product can no longer be called work or process. It is rather a social production or reproduction of conditions and modes of production, a kind of realism of production relations. Althusser would say that social production is only apparently the production of things. In reality, it is the production of a social relation, the reproduction of the relations of production. Tendency to reproduce artistic labor as an alternative production of artworks with the claim to destabilize a fetish of objects has actually turned into a fetishization of process, where the so-called free, non-alienated artistic labor became usable good. Because they represent processes, in the art institutions no longer separate spheres of circulation. They also produce conditions of production and distribution and references, and finally, or initially, desire and consumption. The other blunt statement is about prevalent introduction of so-called service economy into the institutions of arts. This is the point where the final level of so-called aesthetic revolution manifests itself. According to Rancière, the aesthetic revolution has replaced the regime of representation. And there he also bluntly, in the same way as I do, dismisses the concept of poetics, equalizing it to a concept of a regime of representation. By abandoning its representative role, institutions have undertaken the role of regulators of the new regime, an aesthetic regime in which art is art to the extent that it is something else than art. Institution thus becomes aestheticized institution operating in the sphere of service economy, and its contemporaneity lies in simultaneous production and consumption. Fast food type of relation to the production and consumption. Objectification of aesthetic operation and processual aspects of works of art have put artistic labor into a position of real abstraction. Artistic hyper-object, to borrow the term from Timothy Morton, which is characterized by, first of all, viscosity. It adheres and expands no matter how hard we want to get rid of it. And non-locality, which is also very important for today's institutions. It is never here, it is not real, it is always dislocated to the field of aesthetic operation, which paradoxically makes it more real than the real. Institution is then turned into a place where credit invades art, as Jacques Camate foresaw in 1977 for Beaubourg. Institution is a place of promise and not production, and everything is possible just like in the world of capital. To quote Kamate, when execution is replaced by credit, by a blank check, art finds itself reduced to derisory size and at the extreme disappears. This is exactly what Rancière wants to happen in a way when he talks about aesthetic revolution. It disappears by becoming almost the opposite idea, to end the quote of Kamate. Art institution can be an anticipation of politics in the institution, society, life, everything. Finally, it can be an anticipation of art, paradoxically. Art institution, in such institution, the artist is indebted, and she knows her debt. However, her debt does no longer belong to the sphere of creativity, but needs to be verified in something that is the opposite idea. Art has to confirm its value in society, in politics, in economy, and I mean, we are, as artists, are also very much responsible for that. So art cannot confirm its own generic value as the art anymore. It always has to be valorized through another logic. Artist labor has to be presented, and to continue with Kamate, art has to be produced from art and artists in a manner amenable to capital. For what matters is to touch the mass of human beings, otherwise there will be no realization of art, who still haven't internalized capital's lifestyle, who are still more or less bound to certain rhythms, practices, superstitions, etc., and who don't necessarily utilize its image and therefore live a contradiction of jarring and are constantly exposed to future shock. That's the end of Kamate's quote. Institution must become a factory, the one from Lumière, from which the artist lives. But not a factory of works of art or factory of interruptions, breaks, moments of strike. It has to be a factory of continuity, factory of labor, factory of relations of production, or rather anti-production. I will not manage to finish in time, but stop me whenever you think that it was enough. Production incorporating this location, distribution and consumption is nothing new in the world of capitalism. This symptom was defined as early in Marx' Grundrisse, whereas Deleuze and Guattari name it anti-production in Anti-Oedipus. Already at the first pages of Anti-Oedipus, you will find this concept of anti-production. Steven Zepke interprets anti-production in following terms. Anti-production works through all the mechanisms that prevent or recoup creative access, whether by refusing funding or of support, or by rewards that integrate it into the flows of capital. In this sense, anti-production is not opposite of production, but rather supports and develops it. As a result, the greater visibility, prosperity, and integration enjoyed by the arts today doesn't mean that they have more creative freedom. Just the opposite. Contemporary artistic practice marks a particular low point in creativity and insurrectionary spirit, not least because resistance is now aggressively marketed as one of art's selling points. End of Zepke. Those same institutions, and this is the point where the excessive curator's responsibility comes into light, have the possibility to bind artistic labor as abstraction with the reality and not only exchange value. And reality is infrastructure in my, as I said, in my understanding. Instead of abstracting artistic labor, whose use value is then valorized through service economies, erasing the difference between art and labor, the institution has the opportunity to become artist's transparent material basis, which is the case with occupied institutions, for example, in Italy, or, for example, places like PAF in France, or new socio-cultural centers appearing in Europe. This would result in unambiguous political and social, instead of dominantly economic implications of any artistic work to which contemporary institutions tend. Today, while the audience is constantly being educated to expect the art to produce other worlds, the artist is confronted with a very particular expectation: to fix, to repair the world. Despite the fact that it is important to keep away from power paranoia in this context, That small difference that curators have in distribution of power confronts them with the responsibility to more actively explicate productional and presentational policies and to elaborate their position more explicitly in terms of relation with the framework and context of their work. As Derrida put it, responsibility is excessive or it is not responsibility. Easy equalization of the presentational policy inherent to performing arts and deeply problematic market logic of visual arts necessarily leads to productional impoverishment and weakening of institutions, which are the last guarantee, and I will repeat it and emphasize it. Institutions are the last guarantee for a survival of artistic production confronted with the neoliberal populist attack. 1 minute. So, only for the third blunt statement. So I will finish with my blunt statements and not the poetics. The third blunt statement is about documentality. So concept of documentality is borrowed here from Ferraris, who claims that documents have a special ontological status. They are ways of turning social acts into social objects by modes of inscription. Thus, they gain status between physical and ideal objects. And I would say that the way how performance appears today within most of the visual arts institutions is through this logic of documentality. And this is very much related to what Boris was talking about, operation in memory and not historical consciousness. So, documentality is somehow a process of inscription of a performance as a social act into the logic of institutional cultural field. So it's not about just producing and presenting performance, but specifically through the processes of reenactment, for example, this performance becomes a kind of, gets the kind of constitutive force, becomes a very much identitarian, you know, gets the mythological structure. It's reenacted, it's there, it has its kind of past, but it doesn't have history because it's not considered as a construction, but as an act. And there is a huge difference. So the old thesis that performance, give me just 1 minute at least more. The old thesis that performance is ephemeral and volatile and subversive to time no longer applies. There is no time. There is a constant performance. There is just like we are all the time after the time. There is no logic of progress besides the projective temporality which we never achieve to manage. We are never there at the moment when the deadline comes. Time has disappeared into expanding performance. Practices, practical education, dwelling as labor, workshops, labs, exchanges of methodology and knowledge, consultations, performance lectures, research, newsletters, diaries, documentation, archives, all those former forms of production and reflection today shape ways of performing, dispersing and atomizing artistic labor only to make it seemingly more transparent, organized and useful. On one side, the institutions take the role of archiving and documentation of work, but in the same time, performance in museum work as an operation in memory. Memory emptied out of historical consciousness, to come back to Boris, specifically through the reenactment work. And we took very much care when we've been doing these researches in the art of 60s and 70s, not to do reenactments, but reconstructions, and we make a big difference there. Reconstruction considers that every history is a construction and that everything that we approach from the history has to be constructed again as a historical fact. So reenactment imposes the fact that we can just enact again the same thing, which is very much mythological logic. And this is exactly what Brecht criticized about the ways how we approach the themes. I will finish here. Through this operation in memory, that social object, however conflictive as an act in the time of its original production, becomes an object of consensus on past. becomes a social object in which everybody is involved, those who have been watching and those who have been producing into the same object. From 60s on, dance is a practice of consensus, while work that we call radical was developed in white studios and galleries where it appeared as conflicting. When moved to theater, it became consensual even when it represents conflict. The opposite tendency we can witness today. Work by artists who interrupted the logic of choreography in the 90s, being reinterpreted primarily through the logic of practice, of dance, through the logic of practice and the logic of dance, and not through the logic of production and choreography. They very often seem or propose consensual, inclusive and normalizing procedures into the art institutions. And I find it deeply problematic. This is a way of disarming any kind of potential of this artistic practice to make interruption. I thought of talking about the procedures of interruption that we learned about from the 60s and 70s artists like Tomislav Gotovac, some of Jiří Kovanda, Julius Keller. I don't have a time, I miscalculated my future. I would just say that the important thing that we should think about is how do we interrupt the processes, how we open these gaps where we can see how is the situation once when you stand on the brink, on the edge of stage, the moment when I can collapse together with this thing that I'm hanging on because of the jet lag. The question is, how do we demythologize those things that we call founding acts of the history, founding acts of what we do today, and in these terms try to change the logic of watching, logic of dispositives, logic of translation from one to another. And if anybody would be interested, I would be more than happy to share these thoughts, at least privately. Thank you very much.